Alira's hands were shaking so hard she almost dropped the rope. Below her, the stone wall of the pack house fell away into darkness, 3 long floors down, and somewhere behind her, inside the building, she could hear voices calling her name. There was no time left. In less than an hour, she would stand in front of the entire pack and take a vow that was not hers to give. Her father had already chosen her mate for her, a man named Colin, the son of a rival family, picked not because he loved her, not because she loved him, but because his family was owed a debt that stretched back 2 generations. She was the payment. She would not stand for it. Alira had spent the last 3 days planning this moment in secret, memorizing every guard's shift, every dark corner of the pack house where the torches did not reach. Tonight, while the elders prepared the ceremony hall and her mother fussed over the wedding dress laid across her bed, Alira had slipped a rope she'd hidden weeks earlier out from beneath her floorboard, tied it to the iron railing of her balcony, and started to climb down the outer wall of the pack house. The wind cut sharp against her face. Her heart pounded so loudly she was sure someone would hear it from the courtyard below. She forced herself to breathe, to focus only on the next handhold, the next foothold, the next few seconds. If she thought too far ahead, about what would happen if she was caught, about the punishment that would follow, about the look on her father's face, she would freeze completely. A shout rang out from somewhere above her. Torchlight flickered against the stone. They knew. Panic surged through her chest like fire. She glanced down, judging the distance, and realized she was still too high to jump safely. To her left, only a few feet away, a window stood open, its curtain moving gently in the night breeze. It was a guest room, she was almost certain, one of the many empty chambers kept ready for visiting pack members. If she could just get inside, she could hide there for a few minutes, catch her breath, and find another way down once the guards moved past. She swung her body sideways, gripping the rough stone ledge with fingers that had already begun to bleed from the climb. Her boots scraped against the wall, and for one terrible second, she thought she would fall. Then her hand found the windowsill, and with a strength she didn't know she had, she pulled herself up and tumbled through the opening, landing hard on a wooden floor. For a moment she lay still, chest heaving, listening to her own ragged breathing fill the silence of the room. No one had seen her. No one had followed. She let herself feel a flicker of relief. That was when she noticed the smell. It wasn't the stale, unused scent of an empty guest room. It was warm, rich, something like cedarwood and rain, a scent that did not belong to a room no one had lived in for months. Alira's stomach turned cold. She was not alone. She pushed herself up onto her knees, eyes adjusting slowly to the darkness, and that was when she saw him. A tall figure stood near the far wall, arms crossed, perfectly still, watching her with an expression she could not read. He had not made a single sound since she'd crashed through his window. He had simply been standing there the entire time, waiting to see what she would do. Alira's breath caught in her throat. She started, scrambling backward until her shoulder hit the wall. "I'm sorry. I didn't know anyone was in here." The man did not move. His eyes, a deep amber that seemed to catch what little light there was in the room, studied her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. He was dressed simply, a dark shirt open at the collar, no crest, no markings to show rank, but something about the way he held himself, the stillness, the quiet control, told her he was no ordinary guard. "You climbed the wrong wall," he said finally. His voice was low, calm, almost amused. "I need to go," Alira said quickly, already moving toward the door. "Please, just forget you saw me." "That would be difficult," he said, "considering you nearly broke my window." She froze, hand on the door handle, and turned to look at him again. Up close, in the moonlight spilling through the open window, she could see the sharp line of his jaw, the quiet strength in his shoulders, the way his eyes never seemed to leave her face. There was something about him that felt different from anyone she had ever met, a kind of stillness that wasn't weakness at all, but restraint, like he was holding something back. "Who are you?" she asked, though some instinct in her chest already knew the answer would matter more than she wanted it to. He tilted his head slightly, studying her as though the question amused him. "Does it matter? You're the one who broke into my room in the middle of the night." Voices echoed from the hallway outside, closer now. Alira's pulse spiked. She pressed herself against the wall beside the door, out of the line of sight of anyone who might glance in. "Please," she whispered, and this time her voice cracked, just slightly. "I don't have time to explain. I just need a few minutes. That's all I'm asking." For a long moment, he said nothing. The voices in the hallway passed, faded, disappeared toward another wing of the pack house. When he finally spoke again, his tone had shifted, quieter, more careful. "They are looking for you." It wasn't a question. Elira's throat tightened. She thought about lying, about inventing some excuse, a forgotten errand, a late-night walk. But something about the way he watched her, patient and unreadable, made her feel like lies would slide off him without leaving a mark. "Yes," she admitted. "Why?" She hesitated. The ceremony was supposed to be secret until it was finished, a private matter between two families. But sitting there in the dark with a stranger, who had already caught her in the middle of an escape, secrecy felt like a luxury she no longer had. "Because in less than an hour, I am supposed to be mated to a man I have never wanted," she said, the words tumbling out faster than she meant them to. "It was arranged before I was even old enough to have an opinion about it. A debt between families. I am the payment." Something shifted in his expression, so subtle she almost missed it. Not surprise exactly, more like recognition, as though the situation was familiar to him, in a way she couldn't understand. "And you decided the best solution was to climb down the side of a 3-story building in the dark," he said. It seemed better than the alternative. The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, but close to one. "I suppose I can't argue with that logic." Outside, a horn sounded somewhere in the distance, low and mournful, the kind used to call pack members together for important gatherings. Elira flinched at the sound. "That's the signal," she said, more to herself than to him. "They've noticed I'm gone." "Then you have a choice to make," the man said, stepping closer for the first time, his movements smooth and deliberate. "You can go back the way you came, climb back up that wall, and pretend none of this happened, or you can trust a stranger you tumbled in on by accident." Elira looked at him carefully, searching for some sign of deception, some reason not to trust the calm certainty in his voice. She found none, only that same steady patience, as if he had all the time in the world, despite the chaos building just beyond the walls of the room. "Why would you help me?" she asked. "You don't even know me." "No," he agreed, "but I know what it looks like when someone is being forced into something they don't want, and I have never had much patience for it." There was a weight behind his words that told her this wasn't the first time he'd seen it happen. She wanted to ask more, wanted to understand who he was and why a man with such quiet authority was standing alone in a guest room in her father's pack house in the middle of the night, but the horn sounded again, closer this time, and she knew there was no time left for questions. "All right," she said, surprising herself with how steady her voice sounded. "What do I do?" He moved toward the door, motioning for her to stay back, and listened carefully before easing it open just a crack. The hallway beyond was empty, lit only by a few flickering torches along the stone walls. "There's a passage at the end of this corridor," he said quietly. "It leads down to the old storage cellars. Not many people remember it's there anymore. If you can reach it before they search this wing, you'll have a head start." "And if I can't?" He glanced back at her, and for a brief moment, something almost gentle crossed his features. "Then I suppose I'll have to think of something else." Elira's heart pounded as she followed him out into the hallway, staying close to the shadows the way he did, moving quickly, but carefully, each step calculated to avoid the sound that might give them away. She had no idea who this man truly was, no idea why he was inside her father's pack house at all, or why he was risking anything to help a stranger escape a fate that wasn't his problem. But as they moved together through the dim corridor, the sound of search parties growing louder somewhere behind them, she realized she no longer felt quite as alone in her fear as she had just minutes before. They reached the end of the hallway, and he pressed his hand against a section of the stone wall that looked, to her eyes, no different from any other. With a soft grinding sound, a hidden door shifted open, revealing a narrow staircase descending into darkness. "Go," he said, quickly. "I'll make sure no one follows too closely." Elira hesitated at the threshold, looking back at him one last time. "I don't even know your name." A shout rang out somewhere close, urgent, and both of them tensed. "There isn't time," he said, pushing her gently toward the stairs. "Go now." We'll talk later, if there is a later. She stepped through the opening, and the last thing she saw before the hidden door slid closed behind her was the calm, steady look in his amber eyes, watching her disappear into the dark, as if he already knew this was only the beginning of something much bigger than either of them understood yet. The staircase was narrow and cold, the air thick with dust from years of neglect. Elira moved as quickly as she dared, one hand trailing along the rough stone wall to guide her steps in the near-total darkness. Above her, faintly, she could hear the muffled sounds of the search continuing, boots pounding against wooden floors, voices calling her name with growing urgency. She did not know where the passage led. She did not know if it would take her safely out of the pack house or trap her somewhere even worse. All she knew was that for the first time all night, she was not running blind. Someone, a stranger whose name she still didn't know, had given her a path forward, and for reasons she couldn't yet explain, she trusted it. The stairs seemed to go on forever, curving downward in tight spirals until her legs ached, and her breath came in short, sharp gasps. Finally, just as she thought she might lose her sense of direction entirely, she felt cool night air brush against her face. A faint sliver of moonlight appeared ahead, marking the outline of another door. She pushed through it, and found herself standing at the edge of the forest that bordered the pack house grounds, the tall, dark shapes of trees stretching out before her like a wall between her old life and whatever came next. Behind her, the pack house glowed with torchlight, alive with the sound of a search that had not yet found her. Ahead of her lay uncertainty, danger, and the beginning of a choice she had never truly been allowed to make for herself. Elira took a deep breath, glanced once more at the building she had just escaped, and stepped into the shadows of the trees, her mind still turning over the memory of amber eyes and a voice that had promised nothing, except that this was only the beginning. The forest was darker than Elira had expected, the tall trees blocking out most of the moonlight and turning the ground beneath her feet into a maze of shadows and roots. She moved quickly at first, driven by fear, glancing over her shoulder every few steps to make sure no one had followed her through the hidden passage. But as the sounds of the pack house faded behind her, replaced by the quiet rustle of leaves and the distant call of night birds, her pace slowed, and the full weight of what she had just done began to settle over her. She had run away from her own mating ceremony. She had left behind her family, her home, everything familiar, all to avoid a future that had been decided for her without her consent. There was no going back now. Even if she wanted to return, the punishment for what she had done would be severe, and Colin's family would demand consequences for the humiliation of a broken agreement. Her legs ached from the climb and the run, and she finally allowed herself to stop, leaning against the rough bark of an old oak tree to catch her breath. The forest around her was unfamiliar. She had grown up within the walls of the pack house and rarely ventured this far into the woods, and now, standing alone in the dark with no clear plan beyond simply getting away, she felt the first real wave of doubt creep into her chest. What if she couldn't find shelter before sunrise? What if the search parties expanded their reach into the forest itself? She had left in such a hurry that she carried nothing with her, no food, no coin, nothing except the clothes on her back and the fading warmth of adrenaline that had carried her this far. A twig snapped somewhere behind her. Elira spun around, heart hammering, eyes straining against the darkness. For a long moment, there was nothing but silence and stillness, the kind of quiet that made every nerve in her body feel raw and exposed. Then, from between two trees, a pair of glowing eyes appeared, low to the ground, watching her without blinking. She froze. The shape stepped forward slowly, resolving into the outline of a large wolf, its fur dark as the shadows around it, its posture calm rather than threatening. Elira had grown up around shifted wolves her entire life. There was nothing unusual about a wolf moving through pack territory. But this one was not wearing the collar markings of her father's guards, and the calm, deliberate way it approached told her this was no ordinary patrol. "Please," she said quietly, holding perfectly still. "I don't want any trouble." The wolf tilted its head, studying her the way a person might, and then, to her astonishment, it shifted. The change was smooth, almost graceful, until a man stood where the wolf had been only seconds before, tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in the simple dark clothing of a border scout. He regarded her with open curiosity. "You're a long way from the pack house," he said, his tone more cautious than hostile. "Whose lands do you think you're standing on?" Alira swallowed hard, unsure how to answer. She had crossed into unfamiliar territory without even realizing it, and now she stood on the wrong side of a border, exhausted, frightened, and completely without protection. "I didn't mean to trespass," she said carefully. "I was trying to get away from something. I didn't think about whose land I was crossing." The scout studied her for a long moment, his eyes narrowing slightly, as though trying to place her. "You're the girl from the ceremony tonight, the one everyone's searching for." Her stomach dropped. Word had already spread this far. "How do you know that?" "Word travels fast between neighboring packs, especially when it involves an arrangement as old as the one between your family and the Hallow Line," he said. "Half the border scouts have already heard the horn calls tonight." Alira's mind raced, trying to decide whether this man intended to help her or hand her back to the search parties for some reward or favor. Before she could decide what to say next, another voice cut through the trees, calm and familiar. "She's under my protection, Garrick." Alira turned sharply, and there, stepping out from the shadows with the same quiet confidence he'd shown in the guest room, was the man from the pack house. He must have taken a different route through the forest, moving faster and more silently than she would have thought possible, to catch up to her so soon. The scout, Garrick, straightened immediately, his posture shifting into something more formal, more deferential. "My lord, I didn't realize you were involved." Alira's breath caught. "My lord." "You knew," she said, turning to face the man who had helped her escape, a mixture of confusion and something close to betrayal creeping into her voice. "You knew who I was, the entire time, and you never told me who you are." He held her gaze steadily, unapologetic. "You didn't ask the right question. You asked my name, I told you there wasn't time to answer. That's not the same as hiding it." "No," he admitted, "it isn't. But I didn't think it would help you to know you just crawled through the window of the Alpha King of the Northern Territory, in the middle of running from your own mating ceremony." Alira felt the ground shift beneath her, though she hadn't moved an inch. The Alpha King. She had heard stories about him her entire life, whispered around dinner tables, and traded like currency between visiting dignitaries. A powerful leader who kept his territory fiercely independent, who rarely appeared at gatherings with other packs, who was rumored to be as dangerous as he was fair. She had imagined someone cold and distant, not a man who would risk exposing a hidden passage to help a stranger escape through his own window. "Kale," Garrick said quietly, filling in the name she hadn't been given. "The Alpha King." Alira turned the name over in her mind, matching it finally to the calm, steady presence that had guided her through the pack house only an hour ago. Kale. It suited him somehow, simple and strong, without unnecessary decoration. "You should have told me," she said again, though the anger in her voice had softened into something closer to disbelief. "Would it have changed your decision to trust me?" Kale asked. She opened her mouth to answer, then closed it again, unsure. Perhaps it would have. Perhaps knowing that the stranger helping her was the leader of one of the most powerful territories in the region would have made her hesitate, worried about what he might want in return for his help. Or perhaps it wouldn't have mattered at all, not with the horn sounding and the search parties closing in, and no other option in front of her. "I don't know," she admitted finally. Kale studied her for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind his amber eyes, and then he turned to Garrick. "Has anyone crossed the border yet?" "Not that I've seen, my lord, but it's only a matter of time before her father's guards realize the trail leads this direction." "Then we don't have long," Kale said, already moving, his pace quick and purposeful. "Bring her to the outpost. We'll decide what to do from there." Alira hesitated, glancing back the way she had come, toward the pack house she could no longer see through the trees, toward the life she had just left behind, without any plan for what came after. Everything about this moment felt impossibly large, the kind of decision that would shape the rest of her life, and yet she had no time to weigh it carefully. She either followed the Alpha King deeper into unfamiliar territory, trusting a man she had known for less than an hour, or she turned back toward a fate she had risked everything to escape. "All right," she said finally, forcing steadiness into her voice. "Take me to the outpost." They moved quickly through the trees, Garrick shifting back into his wolf form to scout ahead, while Kale stayed close beside Alira, matching her pace, occasionally reaching out to steady her when the uneven ground threatened to trip her in the darkness. She found herself stealing glances at him as they walked, trying to reconcile the calm, careful man beside her with the powerful, feared reputation that had followed his name for as long as she could remember. "Why did you really help me?" she asked quietly, after several minutes of silence had passed between them. "You still haven't given me a real answer." Cale was quiet for a moment, his eyes fixed on the path ahead. "There was someone in my life once who was given no choice about her own future," he said finally, his voice carefully measured. "I couldn't help her in time. I promised myself I would never stand by again if I could do something about it." Illyra didn't press further, sensing the weight behind his words, the careful way he'd chosen not to say more than that. But something about his answer settled a part of the fear still churning in her chest. Whatever his reasons, they were not shallow ones, not the kind of interest that came with strings attached. The trees began to thin ahead of them, and soon the outline of a small stone building came into view, tucked against the base of a hill, smoke curling faintly from a chimney despite the late hour. 2 guards stood near the entrance, straightening immediately at the sight of Cale approaching. "My lord," one of them said, surprise evident in his voice, "we weren't expecting you until morning." "Plans changed," Cale said simply, guiding Illyra toward the door. "Prepare a room. We have a guest who needs rest before we decide anything further." Illyra followed him inside, the warmth of a small fire immediately wrapping around her exhausted body. She sank into a chair near the hearth, the events of the night finally catching up to her all at once, exhaustion pressing down like a physical weight. Cale watched her from across the room, his expression thoughtful. "You're safe here, for tonight at least," he said. "Tomorrow, we'll need to decide what happens next. Your father will not simply let this go, and the debt between our territories complicates things more than you probably realize." "I don't care about the debt," Illyra said, her voice tired but firm. "I care about not being forced into a life I never chose." "I understand that better than you think," Cale said quietly. "But understand this as well. The moment you crossed into my territory tonight, you didn't just escape one arrangement. You may have started something far bigger than either of us expected." Illyra looked up at him, searching his face for some clue as to what he meant, but his expression had settled back into that same careful stillness she had first seen in the guest room, giving nothing away except the quiet certainty that whatever came next, they would face it together, whether either of them had planned for it or not. Morning came too quickly. Illyra woke to pale light filtering through a narrow window, her body stiff from sleeping in a chair she had never meant to fall asleep in. For a moment, disoriented, she forgot where she was. Then the memory of the night before rushed back, the climb, the forest, the revelation of exactly who had helped her escape, and she sat up sharply, heart pounding, as though the danger had never passed. The outpost was quiet in the early hours, only the soft crackle of a fresh fire and the distant sound of voices outside breaking the silence. Illyra stood, smoothing down her wrinkled dress, and made her way to the door, curiosity pulling her toward the source of the voices, despite the exhaustion still weighing on her limbs. Cale stood just outside, speaking quietly with Garrick and another man she didn't recognize, their conversation low and serious. When he noticed her in the doorway, he straightened, dismissing the others with a small nod, before turning his full attention toward her. "You're awake," he said. "I hope you managed some rest." "Some," Illyra admitted. "Enough to remember that I have no plan for what happens next." Cale gestured for her to follow him toward a small table set near the edge of the outpost, where a simple breakfast had been laid out. She hadn't realized how hungry she was until the smell of fresh bread reached her, and she sat down gratefully, allowing herself a few moments of quiet before the weight of her situation returned in full force. "I've been thinking about what you said last night," Cale began, settling into the seat across from her, "about not caring for the debt between our territories. I understand the sentiment, but I need you to understand something as well. That debt is not simple, and it did not begin with your father, or with Colin's family. It goes back further than either of us." Illyra looked up, surprised by the seriousness in his tone. "What do you mean?" Cale leaned back, his expression thoughtful, as though deciding how much to share. 2 generations ago, my grandfather made an agreement with your family's pack, during a time of conflict between our territories. Border disputes, resource shortages, the kind of tensions that used to end in bloodshed, before treaties like this one became common. Your family's pack agreed to certain terms that benefited my territory greatly, and in exchange, my grandfather promised that when the time came, our families would be bound together, strengthening the alliance permanently. So the arrangement between me and Colin was never really about Colin's family at all, Alira said slowly, piecing it together. It's about your family. In part, Cale admitted, though the agreement was written broadly enough that Colin's family found a way to insert themselves into it as well, using an old clause about settling debts through marriage between allied houses. It's complicated, tangled in decades of politics that neither of us had any say in creating. Alira felt a fresh wave of frustration rise in her chest. So no matter what I do, I'm still just a piece being moved around a board I never agreed to play on. Not necessarily, Cale said, his voice steady. The clause Colin's family used was never meant to apply the way they've applied it. If the original agreement was between my family and yours, then any arrangement should have involved my territory directly, not a separate house entirely. It's possible, and I stress possible, that the entire mating arrangement you fled from was built on a misinterpretation, whether intentional or not. Hope flickered in Alira's chest, cautious and uncertain. You think Colin's family manipulated the agreement? I think it's worth investigating, Cale said carefully. But that will take time, and it will require cooperation from records and elders who may not be eager to revisit old disputes. In the meantime, you need somewhere safe to stay, somewhere your father's search parties cannot easily reach. And you're offering that. I am, Cale said, on one condition. Alira tensed slightly, waiting. I need to understand exactly what happened last night. Everything. Not just the parts you've already told me. If I'm going to protect you, and if I'm going to investigate this agreement properly, I need the full truth. No omissions. Alira considered his request carefully. She had already trusted him with more than she'd meant to, but something about the calm, direct way he asked for honesty made her feel like it was a fair trade for the sanctuary he was offering. All right, she said. Ask what you want to know. Over the next hour, Alira told him everything. She told him about the years of quiet dread that had built up as she watched the ceremony date approach, about the conversations with her father that always ended the same way, with him insisting the arrangement was necessary for the good of the pack, about the moments she had tried to voice her objections, only to be reminded that some duties mattered more than personal happiness. She told him about Colin, a man she barely knew, beyond formal introductions at gatherings, who had never once asked for her opinion on the arrangement either, as though her feelings were simply irrelevant to the transaction being made. Cale listened without interrupting, his expression carefully controlled, though Alira noticed the way his jaw tightened at certain parts of her story, the quiet flashes of something like anger that crossed his features before he smoothed them away again. You said someone in your life was given no choice about her future, Alira said finally, remembering his words from the night before. Is that why this matters so much to you? Cale was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire that crackled softly nearby. My sister, he said finally. She was promised to a neighboring house when she was young, long before she had any say in the matter. By the time she was old enough to object, the arrangement had already become tradition, expected by both territories. I tried to intervene, tried to find a way to release her from it, but I was too young at the time to have any real authority, and by the time I did, it was too late to change anything. What happened to her? She's still bound to that arrangement, Cale said quietly. Living a life she never chose, in a territory far from here. We write to each other sometimes, but it's not the same as the freedom she should have had. Alira felt something shift in her chest, a deep well of sympathy mixing with the growing respect she already felt for this man, who had shown her nothing but careful consideration since the moment she'd stumbled into his room. I'm sorry, she said softly. Don't be, Cale said, though his voice carried the weight of old regret. It's part of why I couldn't stand by and watch the same thing happen again. Not when I had the ability to do something about it this time. The conversation settled into a comfortable quiet, the kind that came from two people who had shared something real with each other, even if they had only known one another for less than a day. Alira found herself studying him again, the careful way he held himself, the quiet strength that seemed to radiate from him without any need for display or arrogance. He was nothing like the rumors she had grown up hearing, the distant, dangerous alpha king who kept his territory closed off from outsiders. He was thoughtful, careful, and driven by a sense of justice that felt deeply personal rather than performed for show. "There's something else you should know," Cale said, breaking the silence. "Your father will not simply let this matter rest. Once he realizes you've crossed into my territory, he may see it as an act of aggression, especially given the history between our families. I need to send word to the elders here, explain the situation carefully, before rumors spread and turn this into something far more dangerous than it needs to be. What happens if he demands I return? Then we'll have a difficult conversation," Cale said honestly. "But you are within my territory now, under my protection, and that is not something I take lightly, regardless of old debts or arrangements. No one will force you back against your will while you remain here." The certainty in his voice settled something in Alira's chest, a feeling she hadn't allowed herself in months, maybe longer. For the first time since the arrangement had been announced, she felt like someone was actually listening to her, actually considering what she wanted, rather than simply what was owed or expected. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for all of this. I know you didn't have to help me." "Maybe not," Cale said, a faint smile finally breaking through his careful composure. "But I've never been particularly good at watching injustice happen when I have the power to stop it. Consider it a flaw in my character. I'd call it the opposite of a flaw." Their eyes met, and for a moment, something unspoken passed between them, a recognition that this strange, chaotic night had shifted into something neither of them had expected. Alira didn't know what the coming days would bring, whether her father's fury would lead to conflict between the territories, whether Colin's family would accept the possibility that their claim on her had been built on shaky ground from the start. But sitting there in the quiet warmth of the outpost, across from a man who had risked his own standing to offer her a chance at choosing her own future, she felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Hope. Cale rose from his seat, glancing toward the window where the morning light had grown stronger. "We should move soon. It isn't safe to stay in one place too long. Not until we know how your father intends to respond. I'll take you to my main territory, somewhere with proper protection, and we can begin looking into the details of that old agreement." Alira nodded, standing as well, gathering what little resolve she had left after the exhausting night behind her. "Lead the way." As they stepped out of the outpost together, the early morning sun breaking through the trees in golden streaks, Alira allowed herself one last glance back toward the direction of her old home, the pack house she had grown up in, the family she had left behind without a proper goodbye. She felt no regret. Whatever came next, whatever challenges awaited them both, she knew with a certainty she hadn't possessed in years that she had made the right choice climbing through that window, even if she hadn't known exactly what waited on the other side. Cale's main territory looked nothing like Alira had imagined. She had pictured something cold and fortress-like, matching the stories she'd grown up hearing about the reclusive Alpha King. But instead, she found herself walking through open courtyards lined with autumn flowers, past buildings built from warm honey-colored stone, alive with the quiet bustle of a community that seemed, from what she could tell, genuinely content. Pack members paused to watch as she walked beside Cale, curious glances following them across the courtyard, though no one approached or asked questions. Word had clearly already spread that something unusual had happened, but the respect they held for their Alpha King kept their curiosity carefully contained. "They'll have questions," Cale said quietly, noticing the attention. "But they won't ask you directly, unless I give them reason to trust the situation. Give it time. They're loyal, but cautious with outsiders, especially outsiders connected to old family debts." Alira nodded, grateful for the space he was giving her to adjust. He led her to a private wing of the main house, a comfortable room with a wide window overlooking the eastern gardens, and left her to rest while he attended to what he called urgent matters. She didn't have long to enjoy the quiet. By early afternoon, the sound of raised voices echoed from somewhere near the main entrance, sharp and angry, cutting through the peaceful atmosphere of the territory like a blade. Alira's stomach dropped. She knew that voice. Her father. She rushed from her room, following the sound down a long corridor until she reached a wide hall where a small crowd had gathered. Her father stood near the entrance, flanked by several guards from their pack, his face red with fury. Beside him stood Colin, his expression cold and calculating, and slightly behind them, Colin's father, watching the scene unfold with sharp, assessing eyes. Cale stood at the center of the hall, calm and composed, despite the tension radiating from the group in front of him, his posture giving away nothing except quiet, immovable authority. "You will return my daughter immediately," Alira's father was saying, his voice tight with barely controlled rage. "This is a direct violation of the treaty between our territories. Harboring a fugitive bride is an act of open hostility." "She is not a fugitive," Kale said evenly. "She is a guest in my territory, here of her own free will." "She was promised to my son," Colin's father cut in, stepping forward. "An arrangement generations in the making. You have no right to interfere with matters that do not concern your territory." "On the contrary," Kale said, his voice sharpening slightly, though he remained otherwise composed. "The original agreement this arrangement claims to honor was made between my family and hers. Your family's claim on that debt is questionable at best." A tense silence fell over the hall. Alira, still standing at the edge of the corridor, watched the color drain slightly from Colin's father's face before he recovered, his expression hardening once again. "That is not your decision to make," he said. "The elders of both our territories confirmed the arrangement years ago. It is not something to be undone on a whim, simply because the girl in question decided at the last moment that she preferred a more dramatic escape than the ceremony required. Then perhaps it's time those elders revisit the original terms," Kale said, "given that I intend to raise the matter formally, with full records of the original agreement, before any further steps are taken regarding my involvement in this situation." Alira's father's eyes finally landed on her, standing at the edge of the hall, and his expression shifted from fury into something closer to desperate frustration. "Alira, come here. Now. This has gone far enough." Every instinct in her body wanted to shrink back, to obey the familiar authority in her father's voice, the way she had her entire life. But she forced herself to remain still, forced herself to remember exactly why she had climbed through that window in the first place. "No," she said, her voice steadier than she expected. Her father's expression flickered with disbelief. "Excuse me?" "I said no," Alira repeated, stepping forward now, closer to the center of the hall, closer to the confrontation she had been avoiding her entire life. "I'm not going back. Not to a ceremony I never agreed to. Not to a marriage, arranged without a single conversation about what I wanted. This is not about what you want," her father snapped. "This is about the survival of our pack, about honoring commitments made for the good of everyone, not just yourself." "Then maybe the commitment was made wrong from the beginning," Alira said, her voice trembling slightly but refusing to break. "Maybe it's time someone finally asked what it cost the person it was supposed to protect." Colin, who had remained silent throughout the exchange, finally spoke, his tone flat and unreadable. "Do you understand what you've done? The embarrassment you've caused both our families?" "I understand exactly what I've done," Alira said, turning to face him directly for the first time since her escape. "I've refused to spend the rest of my life bound to someone who never once asked how I felt about any of this. Tell me honestly, Colin, did you want this arrangement, or were you simply as trapped by it as I was?" The question seemed to catch him off guard. For a brief moment, something flickered behind his carefully composed expression. Something that might have been uncertainty, or perhaps even relief, before he masked it again, with the same cold indifference he'd worn since arriving. "It doesn't matter what I wanted," he said finally. "It was expected of both of us. That's exactly the problem," Alira said quietly. Kale stepped forward then, positioning himself slightly between Alira and the visiting group, not aggressively, but with a clear message that the conversation had reached its limit. "She has made her position clear. I suggest we table this discussion until the matter of the original treaty has been properly reviewed. I will send formal correspondence to both your elders within the week, and we can address this through proper channels rather than continuing to escalate tensions in my own halls." Alira's father's jaw tightened, his eyes moving between Kale and his daughter with barely contained frustration. "This is not over," he said finally. "The moment those records are reviewed, and this claim is dismissed, as it should be, she returns with us. And you," he added, turning his glare toward Kale, "would do well to remember that interfering in another territory's arrangements carries consequences, regardless of your standing." "I'm well aware of the consequences of my actions," Kale said calmly. "I'm choosing to accept them regardless." The standoff held for a long, tense moment before Elira's father finally turned, gesturing sharply for his guards and for Colin's family to follow him out. Colin lingered for just a moment longer, his eyes finding Elira's one last time before he too turned to leave, his expression unreadable. The hall fell silent as the group disappeared through the entrance, the heavy doors closing behind them, with a sound that echoed through the stone corridors. Elira let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding, her legs suddenly unsteady beneath her. Cale turned to her immediately, concern replacing the composed authority he'd shown moments before. "Are you all right?" "I think so," Elira said, though her voice shook slightly. "I've never spoken to my father like that before. Never refused him so directly." "You were remarkable," Cale said quietly, and something in the sincerity of his tone made her chest tighten in a way she hadn't expected. "It takes courage to stand against everything you've been taught to accept." "It didn't feel like courage," Elira admitted. "It felt terrifying." "Sometimes those are the same thing," Cale said, a small, genuine smile finally breaking through his composed expression. The tension in the hall slowly began to ease, the pack members who had gathered to watch the confrontation dispersing back to their daily routines, though whispered conversations followed in their wake, curiosity clearly piqued by what they had just witnessed. "He'll come back," Elira said quietly, watching the empty doorway where her father had disappeared. "He won't just accept this." "No," Cale agreed. "He won't. But we have time now. Time to properly investigate the original agreement. Time to gather the evidence we need before this becomes something neither of us can control." "And if the records don't support your claim? If the arrangement really was meant to include Colin's family after all?" Cale was quiet for a moment, considering the question carefully. "Then we'll face that when it comes. But I don't believe that's what we'll find. Something about the way Colin's father reacted just now, the way he avoided directly addressing the original terms, tells me there's more to this than a simple misunderstanding." Elira nodded slowly, though the uncertainty of what lay ahead still churned uneasily in her stomach. Whatever happened next, whatever the records revealed, she knew there was no turning back from the choice she had made. She had stood in front of her father, in front of the man she was meant to marry, and claimed her own voice for the first time in her life. Whatever came next, she intended to keep it. The days that followed settled into a strange, careful rhythm. Elira spent most of her mornings in the territory's small archive room, a quiet chamber lined with shelves of old records, treaties, and correspondence dating back generations. Cale had insisted she be included in the search rather than kept waiting on the sidelines, and though the work was slow and often tedious, she found a strange comfort in it, a sense of control over her own future that she had never been allowed before. An elderly woman named Ivy, the keeper of the territory's records, guided them through the process, her sharp eyes and steady hands moving through fragile pages with practiced care. She had served 3 generations of Alpha leaders and remembered details about old agreements that even written records sometimes failed to capture. "Your grandfather was a careful man," Ivy said to Cale one afternoon, sliding a thick, weathered book across the table toward him. "He documented everything, every conversation, every clause, precisely because he didn't trust verbal promises to survive the years. If there's an answer here, it will be in his own handwriting." Elira leaned closer as Cale carefully turned the brittle pages, his eyes scanning line after line of faded ink. The language was formal, difficult to parse in places, full of the kind of careful legal phrasing that had clearly been designed to prevent exactly the sort of confusion that had led to her current situation. "Here," Cale said finally, his finger stopping on a specific passage. "This is the original clause. It states that in the event of continued peace between our territories, the alliance would be formalized through a union between the ruling families, specifically naming my family line and hers, not any additional house." Elira read the passage herself, her heart quickening as the words confirmed what Cale had suspected from the beginning. So Colin's family really did misuse the agreement. "It looks that way," Ivy confirmed, adjusting her glasses as she leaned over the page herself. "Though I suspect it wasn't entirely their doing. Someone would have needed to approve this reinterpretation on both sides for it to have gone as far as an actual ceremony being planned. My father," Elira said quietly, the realization settling heavily in her chest. "He would have had to sign off on the change." It's possible he was persuaded the reinterpretation was valid, Cale said carefully, clearly trying to soften the implication for her sake. Political pressure between families can be complicated. It doesn't necessarily mean he acted with full knowledge of the deception. But Alira wasn't so certain. She thought back to the years of pressure, the careful way her father had always avoided fully explaining the reasoning behind the arrangement whenever she'd asked, the way he'd grown increasingly evasive as the ceremony date approached. Perhaps he hadn't known everything, but she suspected now that he had, at the very least, chosen not to look too closely at the details, prioritizing whatever benefit the arrangement offered his own position within the pack, over the fairness of the agreement itself. "We have what we need," Cale said, closing the book carefully. "I'll send formal word to the elders of both territories, along with copies of this record. It should be enough to nullify the ceremony's legitimacy, at least as it currently stands." "And then what?" Alira asked. "Even if the arrangement is voided, that doesn't erase the debt between my family and yours." "Doesn't that mean the original terms still apply?" Cale met her eyes steadily. "It does." The weight of what he wasn't saying settled between them, and Alira felt her pulse quicken, uncertain how to interpret the careful way he was choosing his words. "Are you saying the original agreement expects a union between our families specifically?" she asked slowly. "Between you and me?" "That is what the record states," Cale said, his voice carefully even, though something flickered behind his composed expression, something she couldn't quite name. Ivy, sensing the shift in the conversation, quietly excused herself from the room, leaving the two of them alone amid the towering shelves of old records. "I won't pretend that possibility hasn't occurred to me since we found this," Cale continued, once they were alone. "But I want to be clear about something, Alira. I have no intention of trading one arrangement you never chose for another. Whatever happens between our territories, whatever the old agreement technically requires, you will not be forced into anything again, not while I have any say in the matter." Alira studied him carefully, searching for any sign of hesitation or hidden expectation, but found only the same quiet sincerity that had defined every interaction between them since the night she'd stumbled into his room. "I believe you," she said finally, and she meant it. "Good," Cale said, a faint smile touching his lips, "because I meant it." Over the following days, as formal correspondence was drafted and sent to the elders of both territories, Alira found herself spending more and more time in Cale's company, not out of necessity, but by choice. They walked together through the gardens in the evenings, discussing everything from the history of his territory to the small, ordinary details of her life before the arrangement had consumed everything else. She learned that he had taken on the responsibilities of Alpha King far younger than most, following his father's unexpected passing, and had spent years proving himself capable to a pack that had initially doubted whether someone so young could lead them. She told him about her mother, who had passed when Alira was still a child, and how much of her father's rigid insistence on tradition had grown sharper in the years since, as though clinging to old rules had become his way of managing grief he never fully processed. Slowly, carefully, something began to shift between them, something neither of them named directly, but which colored every conversation, with a warmth that hadn't been there in the tense, fearful hours of that first night. "You've changed since that first evening," Cale observed one evening, as they sat together near the edge of the garden, the sky above them painted in soft shades of orange and purple. "You seem less afraid." "I feel less afraid," Alira admitted. "For the first time in years, I feel like my future actually belongs to me." "It does," Cale said simply. "No matter what the elders decide about the old agreement, no matter what happens next, that much will always be true." Alira looked over at him, the fading light catching the sharp lines of his face, the quiet strength that had drawn her attention from the very first moment, despite her fear and confusion that night. "Cale," she said softly, "can I ask you something?" "Of course." "If the elders confirm that the original agreement really does point toward a union between our families, between us specifically, what would you want? Not what the treaty demands. What would you actually want?" Cale was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "I think," he said slowly, "that question deserves an honest answer, and I don't believe either of us is ready to hear it just yet. Not until you've had the chance to choose freely, without the weight of any treaty pressing down on the decision." It wasn't the answer she had expected, but somehow, it felt like exactly the right one. He wasn't trying to sway her, wasn't trying to influence her choice with pretty words before she'd even had the chance to make it. He was, once again, giving her the space to decide for herself, exactly as he had from the very beginning. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for that." "Don't thank me yet," Cale said, a small smile playing at the corner of his mouth. "We still don't know how your father and Colin's family will respond once the elders confirm what we've found. This may only be the beginning of a much larger conflict." As if summoned by his words, the sound of hurried footsteps echoed from the path leading toward them, and Garrick appeared, breathless, his expression tight with urgency. "My lord," he said, "we've received word. The elders have called for a formal gathering to review the treaty records. But there's something else. Colin's family has requested the meeting be moved forward, to 3 days from now, and they've made it clear they intend to bring a counterclaim." Cale rose immediately, his relaxed posture from moments before replaced by sharp, focused attention. "What kind of counterclaim?" "They're saying the girl entered your territory under false pretenses," Garrick said, glancing briefly toward Elara. "That her escape wasn't about freedom at all, but a scheme to manipulate the treaty in your favor from the very beginning." Elara's stomach turned cold. "That's not true. None of this was planned. I didn't even know who Cale was until I'd already climbed through his window." "I believe you," Garrick said quickly, "but belief and proof are different things, especially in front of elders who may already be looking for a reason to dismiss our claim." Cale's expression hardened, the careful calm he'd maintained throughout the tension of the past few days giving way to something sharper, more determined. "Then we'll need more than just the old records to make our case. We'll need to prove exactly what happened that night, from the very beginning, without any doubt left for them to exploit." Elara felt the fragile sense of safety she had begun to build over the past several days start to waver, the looming gathering now casting a shadow over everything that had started to feel, however briefly, like the beginning of a life she had actually chosen for herself. 3 days, she said quietly, almost to herself. 3 days to prove that none of this was a scheme, that all I wanted was the freedom to choose my own future. "We'll be ready," Cale said, his voice firm with quiet determination. "Whatever they intend to accuse us of, we will meet it with the truth, and I promise you, Elara, I will not let them twist this into something it never was." Elara nodded, drawing strength from the certainty in his voice, even as the uncertainty of what the coming days might bring settled heavily over both of them. The next 2 days passed in a blur of preparation. Cale sent word to allied territories, gathering statements and evidence to counter whatever claims Colin's family intended to bring before the elders. Elara spent hours reviewing every detail of the night of her escape, writing down everything she could remember, determined to leave no gap that could be twisted into doubt. But beneath the surface of careful preparation, something else was happening, something neither of them yet knew about. In a small, dimly lit room within Colin's family estate, far from the watchful eyes of Cale's territory, Colin's father sat across from a woman Elara had never met, her face partially hidden beneath the hood of a dark traveling cloak. The woman's name was Wren, and she had built a quiet reputation among certain circles for her ability to move unnoticed, to gather information others believed was safely hidden, and, when necessary, to ensure certain problems simply disappeared before they became public embarrassments. "The elders will not rule in our favor if the original records are presented clearly," Colin's father said, his voice low and tense. "We need something stronger than legal argument. We need the girl removed from the equation entirely, at least until after the formal ceremony has been re-established under our terms." "Removed how?" Wren asked, her tone carefully neutral, though her sharp eyes missed nothing. "Not harmed," Colin's father clarified quickly. "I have no interest in violence. But if she can be convinced, or persuaded, to distance herself from Cale's territory before the gathering, it would weaken whatever case they intend to bring. Perhaps even discredit the entire narrative of her supposed unwilling escape." Wren considered this for a long moment. "You want me to make it appear as though she went willingly, that the story of forced arrangement was fabricated from the start?" "Precisely," Colin's father said. "If I can prove that she orchestrated this entire situation to align herself with a more powerful territory, the elders will have no choice but to dismiss Cale's claim on the original treaty as manipulation, and the arrangement between her and my son will stand as originally planned." "That will require careful work," Wren said. Kale's territory is well guarded, and the girl rarely leaves his sight these days, from what I understand. You have 3 days, Colin's father said firmly. Whatever it takes. Wren rose from her seat, adjusting the hood of her cloak. It will be done. But understand this. My methods are not gentle, even when they avoid direct harm. There will be consequences to whatever story we construct, consequences that may follow the girl long after this arrangement is settled one way or another. I don't care about consequences to her, Colin's father said coldly. I care about protecting my family's position and the honor my son is owed. Wren studied him for a moment longer, something unreadable passing behind her sharp eyes, before she turned and disappeared into the shadows of the corridor without another word. Back within Kale's territory, unaware of the scheme forming against her, Illyra sat with Ivy in the archive room, reviewing the final details of the case they intended to present before the elders. The atmosphere had grown tense but focused, everyone around her working with quiet determination toward the gathering that now loomed only a day away. You've done remarkable work here, Ivy said, glancing over the pages Illyra had carefully compiled, detailing every moment of that fateful night, with as much precision as memory allowed. The elders will have a difficult time dismissing such a thorough account. I hope so, Illyra said, though a lingering unease had settled over her since Garrick's warning about the counterclaim. Something about the timing felt wrong, too convenient, as though Colin's family had anticipated exactly how she and Kale would respond, and had already begun preparing a countermove, before the formal accusation had even been announced. That evening, as the sun began to set over the territory, Illyra decided to take a walk through the gardens alone, hoping the quiet air might settle the nervous energy that had built up throughout the day of preparation. Kale had been occupied with final preparations for the gathering, meeting with allied representatives who had arrived to offer their support, and she hadn't wanted to interrupt the important discussions with her own restlessness. The garden paths were quiet at this hour, most of the territory's residents already settling in for the evening. Illyra walked slowly, breathing in the cool evening air, allowing herself a rare moment to simply exist, without the weight of the coming confrontation pressing down on every thought. She didn't notice the figure watching her from the shadows near the garden's edge, until it was almost too late. You've made quite a mess of things, haven't you? A voice said quietly, and Illyra spun around, to find a woman standing just a few feet away, her face partially hidden beneath a dark hood, her expression unreadable in the fading light. Who are you? Illyra asked, taking an instinctive step backward, her earlier sense of unease sharpening into genuine alarm. Someone who's been asked to have a conversation with you, Wren said, her voice calm, almost pleasant, though something about the careful way she moved sent a clear warning through Illyra's instincts. Nothing more than that for now. I don't know who sent you, but I have nothing to say to you, Illyra said, glancing toward the path that led back toward the main house, calculating the distance, the time it would take to call for help if this conversation turned into something more dangerous. That's unfortunate, Wren said, stepping closer, because I've come a long way to make sure you understand exactly what's at stake here, for you and for everyone connected to this arrangement. Illyra's heart pounded, every instinct screaming at her to run, but something in the woman's calm, deliberate posture told her that running might not be as simple as it seemed. She was, after all, standing in unfamiliar territory, far enough from the main house that a call for help might not carry as quickly as she needed it to. Whatever Colin's family has asked you to do, Illyra said carefully, trying to keep her voice steady despite the fear building in her chest, it won't change the truth. The records prove the original agreement was between my family and Kale's, not Colin's. Wren's expression shifted slightly, something almost like amusement crossing her features. Records can be interpreted many ways, especially when the elders reviewing them have their own interests to protect. But that's not why I'm here tonight. Then why are you here? To offer you a choice, Wren said, before things escalate further than either of us would prefer. Leave quietly. Tonight. Before the gathering tomorrow. Return to your father's territory, apologize for the disruption, and this entire situation resolves itself without further conflict. Stay, and fight this battle at the gathering, and I promise you, the story that gets told about your escape will not be the one you and Kale have so carefully prepared. Illyra's blood ran cold at the implicit threat behind the woman's calm words. You're going to lie. Fabricate evidence to make it look like I planned this from the start. I prefer to think of it as constructing a more convenient narrative, Ren said, her tone still eerily pleasant despite the coldness of her intent. One that serves everyone's interests except yours, unfortunately. I won't leave, Elira said, forcing steel into her voice, despite the fear coursing through her. Not after everything I've already sacrificed to get this far. Ren studied her for a long moment, something almost like respect flickering behind her calculating eyes. A shame, she said finally. I had hoped this could be resolved simply. It seems we'll have to do this the more difficult way instead. Before Elira could react, a sharp, sweet scent reached her nose, and her vision began to blur at the edges, her limbs suddenly heavy and unresponsive. She stumbled backward, realizing too late that the woman had released something into the air between them, some kind of herb, or substance, designed to disorient rather than harm outright. Kale! She tried to call out, but her voice came out barely above a whisper, the world tilting dangerously around her, as her knees buckled beneath her. The last thing she saw before darkness claimed her vision entirely was Ren stepping forward, catching her before she hit the ground, her expression carefully neutral despite what she had just done. Nothing personal, Ren murmured, as the world faded completely into black. Just business. Kale noticed she was missing before anyone else did. He had finished his meeting with the Allied representatives later than expected, and when he went to find Elira, intending to share the good news that 2 neighboring territories had agreed to formally support their claim before the elders, her room stood empty, the evening candle still burning low on the windowsill, untouched. At first, he told himself she had simply gone for a walk, unable to sleep with the weight of tomorrow's gathering pressing on her mind. He checked the gardens, the library, the small sitting room where she had sometimes taken her meals alone, when the pressure of the situation grew overwhelming. Each empty room deepened the unease building steadily in his chest. It was Garrick who found the first sign that something had gone terribly wrong, a faint, unfamiliar scent lingering near the eastern edge of the garden, mixed with the crushed remains of dried herbs scattered across the stone path. This wasn't an accident, Garrick said grimly, kneeling to examine the scene more closely. Someone was here, someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Kale's blood ran cold, every careful, composed instinct he had built over years of leadership giving way to something sharper, more urgent. Track it, he said, his voice tight, with barely controlled fury. Now. The search that followed moved with a speed and precision that reflected the full weight of Kale's authority. Guards mobilizing across the territory within minutes. Scouts dispatched to check every border crossing, every hidden path that led beyond the protected boundaries of his lands. Kale himself shifted, his wolf form moving through the darkening forest, with an intensity that left even his most experienced trackers struggling to keep pace. The trail led east, toward the border shared with Colin's family territory, confirming Kale's worst suspicions almost immediately. This hadn't been a random attack. It had been deliberate, calculated, timed precisely to strike the night before the gathering that would have settled the matter through proper channels. Elira woke slowly, her head pounding, her mouth dry with the lingering effects of whatever substance had been used against her. She was moving, she realized, the rhythmic jostling beneath her suggesting she was being carried, though her limbs remained too heavy and unresponsive to fight against whoever held her. Fragments of conversation reached her through the haze, voices she didn't fully recognize, discussing logistics, timing, the need to reach some destination before dawn. She fought to hold on to consciousness, to gather whatever information she could, but the fog in her mind refused to lift completely, dragging her back under each time she tried to focus. When she finally woke fully, she found herself in a small, sparsely furnished room, the door locked from the outside, a single narrow window offering only a glimpse of unfamiliar trees beyond thick iron bars. Panic surged through her chest as the full weight of her situation became clear. She had been taken. Elira pushed herself up from the narrow bed where she'd been placed, her legs unsteady beneath her as she moved toward the door, testing the handle despite already knowing it would be locked. The room offered no easy escape, no hidden passage like the one Kale had shown her that first fateful night. Nothing, except cold stone walls and the distant, muffled sound of voices somewhere beyond the door. She pressed her ear against the wood, straining to catch fragments of the conversation happening nearby. The elders will believe whatever story we present, especially once they hear her own testimony, Ren's voice said, calm and businesslike. A few carefully chosen words, a written confession claiming the entire situation was staged, and Cale's claim collapses entirely. And if she refuses to cooperate? Colin's father's voice responded, tension evident even through the muffled walls. She'll cooperate, Ren said. People generally do, once they understand the alternative. Elira's stomach twisted with fear, but beneath the fear, something else began to build, a stubborn, burning resolve that refused to simply accept the fate being planned for her. She had already refused once, standing in front of her father and Colin in Cale's own hall, claiming her voice for the first time in her life. She would not surrender that voice now, not even under threat. She moved quickly around the small room, searching for anything that might help her, any weakness in the walls or window that might offer a chance at escape. The window itself was too narrow to fit through even without the iron bars blocking it, but as she examined the bars more closely, she noticed one section where the old metal had rusted through slightly at the base, weakened by years of exposure to weather. It wasn't much, but it was something. She worked at the weakened bar with quiet, careful determination, using a loose stone she'd pried from the edge of the windowsill to strike at the rusted metal, muffling the sound as best she could with the fabric of her sleeve wrapped around the stone. Progress was slow, painfully slow, each strike sending small vibrations up her arm, but she refused to stop, driven by the same desperate determination that had carried her through the window of the packhouse only days before. Outside, unknown to her, Cale's search had finally reached the border of Colin's family territory, the trail leading unmistakably toward a small, isolated structure, tucked away from the main estate, clearly chosen for its remote location. That building has been abandoned for years, Garrick said quietly, crouched beside Cale at the edge of the tree line, both of them studying the structure from a careful distance. If she's being held there, they chose it precisely because no one would think to look. Cale's eyes narrowed, every muscle in his body coiled with barely restrained tension. How many guards? 3 that I can see, Garrick reported, possibly more inside. We move carefully, Cale said, his voice low and controlled despite the fury burning beneath the surface. I won't risk her safety with a reckless approach, but I will not wait until morning either. The small team he had gathered, trusted warriors from his own territory, along with representatives from the allied packs who had arrived to support their claim before the elders, moved silently through the darkness, surrounding the isolated structure with practiced precision. Inside, Elira finally felt the weakened bar give way beneath her persistent efforts, the metal bending just enough to create a narrow gap. It wouldn't be easy, but it might, just might, be enough for her to squeeze through if she was careful. She had just begun working her way through the narrow opening when the sound of the door behind her scraping open sent a fresh jolt of panic through her chest. Well, Ren's voice said from the doorway, cool and unimpressed. You're more resourceful than I gave you credit for. Elira froze, half in and half out of the narrow window, her heart pounding as she turned to face the woman who had drugged and taken her only hours before. Let me go, Elira said, forcing steadiness into her voice despite the fear coursing through her. This won't end the way you think it will. Cale will find me. Perhaps, Ren said, stepping further into the room. But by the time he does, the gathering will have already concluded, and the elders will have already ruled based on whatever testimony we manage to secure from you before then. I won't give you a false confession, Elira said firmly. Whatever you do to me, I won't lie about what happened that night. Something flickered behind Ren's carefully composed expression, an emotion Elira couldn't quite name, before the woman's face settled back into cold professionalism. That remains to be seen. Outside, the quiet night erupted suddenly into chaos, as Cale's team moved in, swift and coordinated, the sound of the struggle carrying clearly through the thin walls of the isolated structure. Ren's head snapped toward the door, her expression shifting from cold control into something closer to genuine alarm. That's not possible, she muttered. Not this quickly. Elira felt a surge of desperate hope rush through her chest. I told you he would find me. Ren moved quickly, grabbing Elira's arm with surprising strength, pulling her away from the window. Then we leave now, before your rescue arrives to complicate things further. but Elira was done being pulled along by forces determined to control her fate. With a burst of adrenaline-fueled strength, she twisted free of Ren's grip, driving her elbow backward with as much force as she could manage, catching the woman off guard, just enough to create the distance she needed. "I'm not going anywhere with you," Elira said fiercely, backing toward the now partially open window. The sound of the door bursting open behind Ren cut off whatever response she might have given, and Cale filled the doorway, his eyes blazing with a fury Elira had never seen from him before, quickly replaced by fierce relief the moment his gaze found her, safe and standing on her own. "Elira," he breathed, and in that single word, she heard everything he hadn't said, the fear, the desperate hope, the relief that had carried him through the entire chaotic search to find her. Ren, seeing the situation shift decisively against her, moved to make a final desperate attempt at escape, but Garrick was already there, blocking the doorway with the same quiet efficiency he'd shown from their very first meeting in the forest. "It's over," Cale said, his voice hard, as he stepped fully into the room, positioning himself protectively near Elira. "Whatever Collins' family paid you to do, it ends here." Ren's composed mask finally cracked, revealing something almost like exhaustion beneath the careful professionalism she'd maintained throughout the confrontation. "You have no idea what you've just started," she said quietly. "This won't be the end of it." "Maybe not," Cale said, "but it's the end of tonight's attempt, and that will have to be enough for now." Elira moved toward him without hesitation, and he wrapped an arm around her protectively, his relief evident in every careful, gentle movement as he guided her away from the small room that had nearly become her prison. "Are you hurt?" he asked quietly, once they were clear of the immediate chaos, his eyes searching her face with careful concern. "I'm all right," Elira said, though her voice still trembled slightly with the lingering fear of everything that had happened. "Just frightened, but I'm all right." "I should never have let you walk alone tonight," Cale said, guilt evident in his tone. "This isn't your fault," Elira said firmly. "You couldn't have known they would go this far." "I should have anticipated it," Cale said. "Collins' family has shown they're willing to fight dirty to protect their claim. I underestimated exactly how far they'd go." As they made their way back toward the safety of Cale's territory, the captured guards and Ren herself being taken into custody by the allied warriors who had assisted in the rescue, Elira felt the full weight of the night's events finally begin to settle over her, exhaustion mixing with lingering fear, and a fierce, stubborn determination that refused to be shaken. Tomorrow's gathering would proceed as planned, and now, with clear evidence of the lengths Collins' family was willing to go to secure their claim, she felt more certain than ever that the truth would finally have its chance to be heard. They returned to Cale's territory as the first pale light of dawn began to creep across the horizon, the exhausted group moving slowly through the quiet paths that led toward the main house. Elira could barely keep her eyes open, the events of the night finally catching up with her in full, but she refused to rest until she had spoken with Cale about what had happened, about what it meant for the gathering only hours away. "You need sleep," Cale said gently, as they reached the entrance to her room, his hand lingering protectively near the small of her back, though he was careful, as always, not to overstep. "The gathering isn't until midday. You have time." "I don't think I can sleep," Elira admitted, her voice quiet with exhaustion, but honest. "Every time I close my eyes, I see that room, hear her voice telling me I'd have to cooperate one way or another." Cale's expression softened, understanding written clearly across his features. "Would it help to talk instead? Or would you prefer quiet company? Someone simply nearby while you try to rest?" The question, so carefully considerate, so entirely focused on what she needed, rather than what he assumed she should want, settled something warm and grateful in her chest, despite the exhaustion weighing on her. "Quiet company," she said finally. "If you don't mind staying a while." "I don't mind at all," Cale said, following her into the small sitting area near her window, settling into a chair, while she curled up on the small couch nearby, her body finally beginning to relax, now that the immediate danger had passed. They sat together in comfortable silence for a long while, the soft light of dawn slowly filling the room, until Elira finally spoke again, her voice quiet but steady. "When I heard your voice at the door," she said, "I've never felt relief like that before. Like something inside me finally settled, knowing you'd found me." Cale was quiet for a moment, his eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her breath catch slightly. "I felt something similar, the moment I saw you were safe. I don't think I've ever moved that quickly in my life, not even during the most urgent moments of leading this territory." "Do you think," Alira said carefully, "that what we're feeling has anything to do with the old agreement? The possibility that we were always meant to be bound together?" Cale considered the question seriously, clearly giving it the weight it deserved rather than offering a quick, comfortable answer. "I've wondered that myself," he admitted. "But I don't think what I feel for you comes from an old piece of paper written by our grandparents. I think it comes from watching you refuse to bend to a fate you never chose, from seeing the courage it took to climb through that window in the first place, from every conversation we've shared since that has nothing to do with treaties or debts." Alira felt warmth spreading through her chest at his words, something that had nothing to do with exhaustion or fear, something entirely new and fragile and precious. "I think I feel the same way," she said softly. Before either of them could say more, a soft knock interrupted the moment, and Ivy's careful voice called from the hallway, "My lord, forgive the interruption, but there's something you both need to see before the gathering begins." Cale rose immediately, exchanging a glance with Alira before opening the door. Ivy stood there, an old, worn book clutched carefully in her hands, her expression a mixture of excitement and urgency. "I found something," Ivy said, stepping into the room, "while searching for additional evidence to support your claim before the gathering. It's a passage I overlooked before, tucked deep within your grandfather's private journal rather than the formal treaty records." She opened the book carefully to a marked page, and Cale and Alira leaned in together to read the faded handwriting. The passage described, in careful detail, an old belief held by Cale's grandfather, one not uncommon among certain bloodlines within their kind, that true unions marked by fate rather than arrangement would reveal themselves through a physical sign, a mark that appeared beneath the moon's light when two bonded souls stood close together for the first time after recognizing the connection between them. "A moon mark," Cale said quietly, reading the passage again. "I've heard old stories about this before, but I always assumed it was more legend than reality." "Your grandfather clearly believed otherwise," Ivy said. "He wrote here that he witnessed it himself, once, between two pack members whose union had nothing to do with arranged agreements. If such a thing is real, it could serve as undeniable proof before the elders, proof that whatever exists between the two of you goes beyond old debts and arranged obligations." Alira felt her heart race at the implication, a mixture of hope and uncertainty swirling together in her chest. How would we know for certain, if it's real? "The passage suggests it only reveals itself under specific conditions," Ivy said, flipping to another marked page. "Beneath direct moonlight, between two people who have already recognized their connection, even if unspoken." Cale looked over at Alira, something vulnerable flickering behind his usually composed expression. "We won't know unless we try," he said quietly. "Though I understand, if this feels like too much, given everything you've already been through tonight." Alira thought about the exhaustion weighing on her body, the lingering fear from her ordeal, the uncertainty of what the gathering might bring later that day. But beneath all of it, she felt something else, a quiet, steady curiosity, a desire to understand exactly what connection existed between them, separate from any old treaty or arranged obligation. "I want to try," she said finally. They waited until the sun had fully set that evening, the gathering having concluded its first session with formal introductions and preliminary statements, testimony postponed until the following morning to allow both sides time to prepare fully in light of the previous night's dramatic events. Cale led Alira to a quiet clearing near the edge of the territory, far from prying eyes, the full moon rising bright and clear above the treetops. "Are you certain about this?" Cale asked one final time, his voice gentle, despite the anticipation clearly building beneath his careful composure. "I am," Alira said, and she meant it completely. They stood facing each other beneath the silver light of the moon, and for a long moment, nothing happened at all, only the quiet sound of the night around them, the soft rustle of leaves in the evening breeze. Alira felt a flicker of disappointment, wondering if perhaps the old legend truly was nothing more than a story after all. Then, slowly, a warm sensation began to spread across her wrist, faint at first, like the gentle brush of sunlight against skin, growing steadily stronger, until she gasped softly, looking down to see a delicate pattern beginning to emerge beneath her skin, glowing faintly silver in the moonlight, a design she had never seen before, intricate and beautiful, unmistakably real. Kale's breath caught audibly, and when she looked up, she saw the same pattern beginning to form along his own wrist, mirroring hers exactly, glowing with the same soft silver light. "It's real," Elira whispered, staring at the mark in wonder. "It's real," Kale echoed, his voice thick with emotion he no longer bothered to hide. "Elira, whatever the old treaty required, whatever arrangement our families believed they were creating, this mark tells us something far more certain. This was never about debts or obligations. This was fate, choosing us, long before either of us understood what that meant." Elira felt tears gathering in her eyes, though they were tears of relief, of joy, of a happiness she had never allowed herself to imagine possible only days before. "I never thought I'd find something like this," she said softly. "Not after everything I was told my future would be." "Neither did I," Kale admitted, "but I'm endlessly grateful you climbed through the wrong window that night." A soft laugh escaped her, breaking through the emotional weight of the moment. "So am I." They stood together beneath the moonlight for a long while, the glowing marks slowly fading from view, though the warmth of the connection they represented remained steady and certain between them. Tomorrow, they would return to the gathering, armed not only with evidence and testimony, but with undeniable proof of a bond that no old treaty, no scheming family, no arranged obligation could ever have manufactured on its own. Whatever challenges still awaited them, Elira faced them now with a certainty she had never possessed before. She was no longer simply running from a fate she didn't choose. She had found, instead, a future she wanted with her whole heart, standing beside a man who had never once tried to control her choices, only to protect her right to make them. The gathering hall stood packed the following morning, elders from both territories seated along the raised platform at the front of the room, their expressions carefully neutral despite the obvious tension that had built throughout the previous day's events. Word of the failed kidnapping attempt had spread quickly, and though official statements had not yet been made, the whispered conversations filling the hall made clear that everyone present understood the stakes had shifted dramatically overnight. Elira sat beside Kale near the front of the assembly, the faint silver pattern on her wrist hidden beneath the sleeve of her dress, though she carried the knowledge of what it meant, like a quiet source of strength steadying her nerves. Across the hall, her father sat with a tense, unreadable expression, while Colin's family occupied seats slightly apart, their usual confidence notably absent this morning. The head elder, a stern but fair woman named Elder Mabel, called the gathering to order, her sharp eyes moving across the assembled crowd before settling on the matter at hand. "We convene today to resolve a dispute regarding the treaty established between the Hallow Territory and the Border Pack, specifically concerning the interpretation of the marriage clause and its rightful application," Elder Mabel began, her voice carrying clearly through the silent hall. "However, given the events of last night, we must first address a matter of significant concern before proceeding further." She turned her attention toward Colin's father, her expression hardening slightly. "It has come to our attention that an attempt was made to remove the young woman at the center of this dispute from Kale's territory, through deception and coercion. Do you deny involvement in this matter?" A tense silence fell over the hall as every eye turned toward Colin's father, whose composed expression had begun to crack under the weight of the accusation laid bare before the assembled elders. "I acted to protect the legitimate interests of my family," he said finally, his voice tight with barely controlled defensiveness. The girl's escape threatened to unravel an arrangement that had been formally recognized for years. "That is not an answer to my question," Elder Mabel said sharply. "Did you orchestrate the abduction of Elira from Kale's protected territory?" The silence stretched painfully long before Colin's father finally answered, his shoulders sagging slightly, with the admission he could no longer avoid. "Yes," he said quietly, "I did." Murmurs rippled through the hall, and Elira felt Kale's hand find hers beneath the table, steadying her as the weight of the confirmed truth settled over the assembly. "This is a serious violation of treaty law," Elder Mabel said, her voice cold with disapproval. "Regardless of any claims your family may have held regarding the original agreement, Resorting to coercion and deception to enforce those claims cannot be tolerated within our territories. This alone casts significant doubt on the legitimacy of your family's involvement in this matter entirely. Colin, seated beside his father, looked visibly shaken by the unfolding revelations, his earlier cold composure replaced by something closer to genuine distress. When the elders finally turned their attention toward him, asking whether he had been aware of his father's plans, he shook his head firmly. "I knew nothing about this," Colin said, his voice steady despite the tension in the room. "I would never have agreed to something like this, regardless of how I felt about the arrangement itself." Elira watched him carefully, searching for any sign of deception, but found only genuine distress, the same uncertainty she had glimpsed briefly during their confrontation days before. Whatever role Colin had played in the arrangement forced upon them both, he had never been the architect of the cruelty that followed. "We will address the matter of the abduction separately, through formal proceedings that will determine appropriate consequences," Elder Mabel continued. "For now, let us return to the original matter at hand, the interpretation of the treaty's marriage clause." Cale rose then, presenting the evidence he and Elira had carefully gathered over the past several days, the original records from his grandfather's private archive, the specific language naming his family line directly, rather than any broader interpretation that could include Colin's house. The elders reviewed the documents carefully, passing them among themselves, their expressions growing increasingly certain as the clear language of the original agreement left little room for alternative interpretation. "The evidence presented is compelling," Elder Mabel said finally, after a lengthy discussion among the assembled elders. "The original treaty clearly names the Hallow family line as the intended party for any future union, not the broader interpretation that has been applied by Colin's family in recent years. We find that the arrangement between Elira and Colin was based on a misapplication of the original agreement, whether intentional or the result of genuine misunderstanding passed down through generations." A wave of relief washed through Elira's chest, though she remained carefully composed, aware that the proceedings were far from finished. "However," Elder Mabel continued, "this does not automatically dissolve the debt owed by the Border Pact to the Hallow territory. The original terms still require resolution, one way or another, according to the specific language recorded in the treaty." Elira's father rose then, his expression a complicated mixture of frustration and something closer to reluctant acceptance. "What resolution do the elders propose?" Elder Mabel glanced briefly toward Cale and Elira before answering. "Given the clear language of the original treaty, the debt would traditionally be resolved through a union between the Hallow family and your own, specifically involving your daughter and the current Alpha King of that territory." Elira felt her heart race, though not with the fear that had once accompanied any mention of an arranged union. She glanced at Cale and found him watching her with quiet, careful attention, waiting to see how she would respond before saying anything further. "With respect," Cale said, rising to address the elders directly, "I do not believe any union should be enforced without the full and willing consent of both parties involved, regardless of what the treaty technically requires. I have seen firsthand the harm caused by arrangements forced upon people without their agreement, and I refuse to perpetuate that harm, even to settle an old debt." Elder Mabel studied him carefully, something like respect flickering behind her sharp eyes. "A fair position, Alpha King. But the debt still requires resolution through some means." Cale turned to Elira then, and though the formal setting of the gathering hall was far from the private, moonlit clearing where they had discovered the truth of their connection the night before, he asked the question anyway, his voice carrying clearly through the silent hall. "Elira," he said, "I would never ask you to accept this union simply to settle an old debt between our families. But I am asking you now, freely, without any obligation attached, whether you would choose this future with me, not because a treaty demands it, but because it is what you genuinely want." The entire hall fell silent, every eye turned toward her, waiting for her answer. Elira felt no fear in this moment, no sense of being cornered or forced into a decision that wasn't hers to make, only certainty, warm and steady, settling deep in her chest. "I would," she said clearly, her voice carrying through the hushed hall without hesitation. "Not because of any treaty or debt, but because somewhere between climbing through the wrong window and everything that has happened since, I found something I never expected to find, something real." A soft murmur of surprise and approval rippled through the gathered crowd, and Elder Mabel allowed herself a rare, small smile. Then let the record show that the debt between these two territories has been resolved, not through obligation, but through willing union between two individuals who have chosen this path freely. Elira's father remained quiet for a long moment, his expression complicated, before finally rising to address the hall one final time. "I owe my daughter an apology," he said, his voice heavy with something that sounded almost like genuine regret. "I allowed old traditions and misguided pride to overshadow what should have mattered most, her own happiness and consent. I hope, in time, she can forgive the role I played in nearly costing her that." Elira looked at her father, years of complicated tension and unspoken resentment settling into something quieter, not fully resolved, but no longer as sharp and painful as it had been only days before. "I forgive you," she said softly, "but I need you to understand, going forward, that my choices belong to me." "I understand that now," her father said, more clearly than I ever have before. As the gathering began to disperse, the formal matters resolved, and the more serious consequences facing Colin's father left for separate proceedings to determine, Elira felt Cale's hand find hers once again, warm and steady, a quiet promise of everything still to come. "That went better than I expected," Cale said quietly, a small, relieved smile finally breaking through his composed expression. "Much better," Elira agreed, allowing herself to finally relax fully, for the first time in what felt like days. "Though I imagine there's still quite a lot left to figure out." "There is," Cale said, "but we'll figure it out together, exactly as we should." Elira smiled, looking around at the hall slowly emptying around them, at the life she had never imagined possible, only a week before, one built not on obligation or old debts, but on genuine choice and quiet, steady partnership. Whatever challenges still lay ahead, she faced them now with a certainty and hope that had felt impossibly distant on the night she first climbed through the wrong window, searching desperately for any escape from a future that wasn't hers to choose. She had found something far better than escape. She had found a future entirely her own. Weeks passed, and the territory that had once felt so unfamiliar to Elira slowly began to feel like home. She spent her mornings continuing her work in the archive room alongside Ivy, who had taken a genuine liking to her, sharing stories of the territory's history that stretched back generations, and her afternoons walking the same gardens where fear had once gripped her chest, now filled instead with a quiet, growing sense of belonging. The formal proceedings against Colin's father had concluded a week after the gathering, the elders determining a series of consequences that stripped away certain privileges his family had held within the broader treaty network, a fitting resolution for the deception he had orchestrated. Wren, when questioned about her involvement, had cooperated fully once she understood the full truth of the situation, revealing that Colin's father had misled her about the nature of the arrangement she'd been asked to help enforce, information that lessened her own consequences considerably, though she remained under careful watch by both territories for the foreseeable future. Colin himself had reached out once, a brief, careful letter expressing genuine relief that the truth had finally come to light, and a sincere hope that Elira had found the happiness she deserved. She had written back, wishing him the same, grateful that whatever bitterness might have lingered between them had been replaced instead with a quiet, mutual understanding that neither of them had ever truly wanted the arrangement forced upon them in the first place. Her father visited twice in the following weeks, each visit a little easier than the last, the rigid formality that had once defined their relationship slowly softening into something more genuine. He never fully abandoned his belief in tradition and duty, but he had begun, however slowly, to understand that those values meant little if they came at the cost of his daughter's happiness and consent. Cale, throughout it all, remained exactly as she had come to know him during those first chaotic days, steady and thoughtful, never rushing her, never pressuring her toward decisions before she felt ready to make them. Their bond, marked so clearly beneath that first moonlit sky, only continued to deepen with each passing week, built not on the foundation of an old treaty, but on genuine understanding and shared respect that had grown naturally between them. One evening, nearly 2 months after the night Elira had first climbed through the wrong window, Cale found her in the garden where they had spent so many quiet evenings together since, the sky above painted once again in soft shades of orange fading slowly into deep blue, "I have something to ask you," he said, and something in his tone, careful and slightly nervous in a way she rarely saw from him, made her turn to face him fully, curiosity piqued. "What is it?" Cale reached into his pocket, retrieving a small, delicate object that caught the fading evening light, a simple but beautifully crafted band, clearly made with careful attention rather than ostentatious display. "I know we've already been bound by fate, by a mark neither of us expected or asked for," he said, kneeling before her with the same quiet sincerity that had defined every moment of their journey together. "But I wanted to ask you properly, without any treaty or old debt attached to the question. Alira, will you choose to build a life with me, not because destiny marked us, but because you want this future for yourself?" Tears gathered in Alira's eyes, though this time they carried nothing but joy, a happiness so full it nearly overwhelmed her entirely. She thought back to that terrified night, climbing down a rope in the darkness, certain she was running toward nothing but uncertainty and danger. She had never imagined, not for a single moment, that the wrong window she'd chosen in her panic would lead her to exactly where she was always meant to be. "Yes," she said, her voice steady, despite the emotion thick in her throat. "I choose this. I choose you." Cale rose, slipping the band gently onto her finger, his own eyes bright with an emotion he no longer bothered to hide, and pulled her close, the warmth between them settling into something certain and unshakable, built on trust earned through fire, rather than simply granted by fate alone. The formal mating ceremony took place a month later, beneath the same full moon that had first revealed the truth of their connection, surrounded not by the tension and fear that had defined the ceremony Alira had once fled, but by genuine celebration from both territories, now united not through old debts, but through a bond freely chosen and openly embraced. Her father stood among the guests, his expression proud rather than merely dutiful, a transformation that had taken months of careful, honest conversation to achieve, but one that felt entirely genuine by the time the ceremony finally arrived. Ivy stood nearby, beaming with quiet pride, having played her own small but crucial role in uncovering the truth that had ultimately set everything right. Garrick, ever loyal, stood watch at the edge of the gathering, though even his usually serious expression softened into something like genuine happiness as he watched the ceremony unfold. As the final vows were spoken beneath the silver light of the moon, the delicate marks on both their wrists glowing softly once again, in quiet confirmation of the bond that had brought them together, Alira felt a profound sense of peace settle over her, the kind of peace that came not from escaping a difficult situation, but from building something real and lasting in its place. She thought back, one final time, to the terrified girl who had climbed through the wrong window on a desperate night many months before, certain only that she couldn't accept the future being forced upon her, with no idea what waited on the other side of that reckless choice. She had found, in the end, exactly what she never dared to hope for, not merely an escape from an unwanted fate, but a genuine, chosen future, built on respect, understanding, and a connection deeper than any old treaty could have ever manufactured on its own. The Alpha King who had been waiting behind that window, quiet and watchful in the darkness, had turned out to be not an obstacle to her freedom, but the very key to finding it, exactly where she had least expected to look. And as the celebration continued long into the night, laughter and warmth replacing the fear and uncertainty that had once defined her path, Alira understood, with complete and unwavering certainty, that she had climbed through exactly the right window after all.